last installment today. We're going to look at the Story Smith. And in case some of you don't get anything on curriculum development, this will give you a little background on it. It'll give you just enough to get you in big time trouble, but at least it'll give you a foundation. Some of our lesson objectives for today are to capture the meaning and some of the principles of curriculum, and then discover clues that can help you create a very strong local curricula as well. I remember when we were doing our Acts commentary, we had a number of people working with us in there, EFOGO, and one of them was a younger guy, probably 18-ish, somewhere in that. And he made this comment as we were working through some of the curriculum. He said, "This makes me want to study all the more. Hey, we haven't been doing communion." And so that's what you want to happen when you're working as a team on curriculum development for the people that you're working with. So what is curriculum though? That's a major question for us. And one of the things we need to see is that it is very integrated, it's very comprehensive. It takes in all the activities, those relationships that are there. In fact, it's the Latin word for a circular racetrack, which means what? You're going to get in everything in there. So your overall design, your objectives that you have for the individual lessons or the collections of lessons, whatever it happens to be, the content you're going to cover, how you're going to apply that content, all that is incorporated in the circular racetrack, and that is incorporated in curriculum itself. So what is the sequence for the curriculum developers? And I like to think of us working as a team, and not everybody will be involved in every aspect of this, but they can be involved as a part of the team to then contribute to making good curriculum. And one of the things we're going to find out is you don't start with, let's write the curriculum, now let's go teach it. That's about the worst way you can do it. And in fact, it starts beyond that, right? Good curriculum is tested teaching, but what's tested teaching? It goes beyond that. It goes back to what we were talking about before, collecting stories, collecting the oral histories of these people, collecting their life histories as well, and their life stories, so that we know who we're talking to. And then analyzing those stories to see how they actually communicate through stories, and then smith that together with what you're doing in the Bible story, and now you go out and you practice it. Storytellers tell stories, and now you really put that down in curriculum format, because that's what you want to have happen. You want to have happen that the curriculum that is coming out of this is tested teaching. It's not just written stuff that we have put down and now went out and done. No, it started from teaching, and then the more times you can do that, 3 or 4 times, that'll help perfect it, get that curriculum in really, really good shape. It all begins, as we noted before, asking the Holy Spirit, the one who has put out one of the most effective multi-genre curriculum ever to exist in the world. And so he is the source of our power, our strength, our wisdom, our insight as we develop it. So what are some of the possible options for the curriculum team or the curriculum developers? Well, one of them is, of course, and this happens consistently over and over again, you import it. Okay, we've got all this nice stuff written over here. We've used it before. It works here great. We just import it. And that reminds me of what Larry Dinkins ran into when he was the president of Bangkok Bible College, and he was looking for somebody to write a book on theology. And he could not find somebody on systematic theology. He could not find a Thai that would be able to do that. And so they ended up just translating Thiesen's book on that. And that's what we call imported. And as my friend Bob Ferris would say, who also worked in the Philippines, he would say, borrowed curricula are always inappropriate curricula. Okay, now the second option, what can you do? Okay, well then we'll have the expats write it, okay? And If you are familiar with theological education by extension, it started way back in the 60s. Ralph Winter, Kinsler, who else? Ted Ward, all these people were involved in that, is taking the school to the people so that they didn't have to disrupt their lives and bring them to some city to study in a school. And when that happened, only the young people came, and of course they didn't have because of their youth, didn't have the joy of that somebody locally would have us more mature and been there in older years and so forth. So that was the answer to that problem. And it's interesting, I actually took a course from Ted Ward up at Michigan State, and he invited us over to his house one night, the Christians, and so we knew he was writing on something on theological education by extension, and that it was kind of a critique of it, but he wouldn't tell us what it was, and he wouldn't show us what it was. But we learned later on is that the reason he would leave theological education by extension is because the expats were writing the curriculum, and his goal was to have the locals write the curriculum, which leads us now to option 3, which is have them, the locals, they're right there, right? They know the people, they know the audience, they have connections to the society, so they're the ones that could write it. And we could ask, well, are there any other options besides those 3 that are there? And I'm going to offer you, propose before you a 4th option, and that is participatory curricula development. And by that I mean you're using locals and you're using outsiders as well. And you're working as a team to put this all together. So in, excuse me, so in Passing the Baton, I wrote this: a participatory model for developing curriculum takes time and flexibility. Moreover, should be regarded as a service rendered among or with people, not to or for. The advantage is that in the long run, it produces ownership, accountability, and relevant evangelists and teachers, all of which facilitate the phase-out process. Later on, I would write, and I did a book with Lois McKinney Douglas in Encountering Missionary Life and Work, and I wrote this: traditionally, Bible curricula from the West was taken to the rest of the world and translated verbatim. This global curricula, once for all, was considered applicable for the world, while still being done by some among many in the majority world. This has resulted in a negative reaction and calls to establish local contextualized curricula, one for each unique setting. Each people group deserves their own curriculum. This type of demand may work well when working with specific people groups, and that would be like we did with the Ifugao. But the urban setting presents a much more complex world that demands a different type of approach, and we call that global curriculum, one for some, and will meet the needs of the multifaceted cultural mosaic that we find in those urban settings. So we looked at it, you can have global, one for all, and if we look at some of in the story world, simply the story used God's story, that video for it's 80 minutes, I think, and it's universal. They put that in anywhere, translate it, and so forth. They make that a global one. Or you can do the glocal. So this is more for when you have a little messy context in those urban settings or even religious settings. And the Story of Hope from Abwe would represent that, where they have some for the folk Buddhism, and secular Buddhism. And there's varieties within that. And so they look at it more as a generic type of approach to these particular audiences. And then you have the local, like we did for the Ifugao, or one story, which is designed for a particular context, and it's usually chronological in order and so forth. So those are 3 ways of looking at how we're going to put our curriculum together. Well, what makes a good curriculum developer? And I'm going to give you some um, principles that was laid out a long time ago in theological education by extension, but has, I think, some great application even for today if we make a few adjustments along the way. And so for TEE writers, and usually those were individuals who wrote these courses up. Um, they wanted them to be experts in their field. Okay, good for that. Yes, and they've also taught on the subject. Yeah, so it's not just I'm just doing this. No, you're experienced teaching on the subject. So there's been trial and error. You've improved yourself. You're convinced of the value of self-instructional courses, and for them, it was designed to be done individually. A lot of fill in the blanks, fill in the words, and so forth. And so we would change some of that, of course, but you would whichever one you use, whichever model you go for, you want to be convinced of this value of it, and then understand the basic principles of educational of education itself. So many people at the local level may not have that, and that's why if you have somebody from the outside who has that background, they can project that to the team itself and train them in those type of principles in education. The fifth one is principles for designing self instructed courses. So rather than that, we would change that to the storing part. How would we adapt that? But they need to know those principles, and they may not know those principles locally. They may be able to tell stories in their own language, but they've never dissected it, never exegeted how they do what they do. And so we can help break that down for them. Understand the culture for which they are to write. Oh, good. Okay, locals can do that. Expats can learn about that. I learned about Ifugao culture. And so there's a combination that, because I see things they don't see, and they see a lot of stuff that I don't see. And so that back and forth dialogue makes your curriculum that much more solider. And they are relieved of other duties so they can concentrate on writing this material, and they have to be self-disciplined. Okay, that's fine. And now here's a couple of important ones, I think. They're eager to consult others in writing, editing, and evaluation of their material. Remember, this is usually done individually. Now it's going to be done as a team. So this is what you're going to be doing back and forth with each other all the time. How do you think they're going to understand this? Is this okay? This word or this phrase okay? Are they mature enough to accept criticism? So remember, we're talking in many contexts here in honor shame society. So to be critiqued is to say your stuff is terrible, which says you're a bad person. So we have to be very careful on how we give that critique, but everybody has to be able to take that critique. And then the last principle that they have is they're ideally locals, they're nationals in the country concerned. And so we would add to that, we'd like to see a multinational team put together to do this. So another question would be then, what does it take to have effective Bible curricula? And I think as you're thinking about your overall plan for curricula for your particular group, it's got to be comprehensive. So that they've got to get it from Genesis to Revelation, right? It has to have a overarching understanding of this story, what we call the grand narrative, right? And the next two go together. It has to be contextual and confrontational. So it has to be adapted to them, but it also has to challenge them. So we had to challenge the Ifugao. The contextual was, yes, they did animal sacrifices, but it wasn't for, and here comes the confrontation, it wasn't for removing sickness, it was for removing sin. So we had to make that. So there's a contextual aspect to it and a confrontational aspect to it. And it calls for immediate involvement. And then it needs to be memorable. If they can memorize it, or not memorize it, but if it becomes memorable in their life, then what can they do? They can go out and reproduce it. So if they can't reproduce it, then we know we're back to square one in our curriculum. So it needs to be comprehensive, contextual and confrontational, call for immediate involvement, and be memorable and then be reproducible. In her book, Communicating Through Story Characters, Pamela Brook makes this, offers these basic script writing rules, she calls them, that will make your curriculum a lot stronger. She said, action is better than description. So let them do it. Don't tell what they did. Characterization is better than preaching. Let the characters preach the sermon, right? Short is better than long. Simple is better than more complex. And less is better than more. So some interesting little tidbits that she offers there that I think carry a lot of weight. Well, let's look at some of the cross-cultural organizing principles in curriculum development. I'm going to take this from Leroy Ford's book on a curriculum design for theological education. And one of the first ones that he has there is somebody. So this means that audience out there. Who is that audience? That means we need to be a learner, and that's why we collect stories, life stories, and so forth, and analyze them to figure out who our audience is. It has to be something, which means now we're going to get into scope and sequence of this. So how big are we going to go here, and what's the sequence in which we're going to offer it, and so forth. So which stories are going to be incorporated? And when we do that, we have to ask ourselves, what are the cultural implications of those stories? So when we looked for, well, let me go through the three and then come back to that. The second one would be then the theological implications for the story. And so we have something in our mind that we're trying to communicate, whether it's through evangelism or discipleship, leadership, development, whatever it happens to be. And then there's curricula implications as well. So the theological kind of sets, okay, we need to cover this, this, and this. What culture stories, Bible stories that have cultural implications to our audience will convey those theological concepts. And so that's why we would do, for us, what was always thinking agricultural because of our people, and what are the agricultural stories? And one of the things that an Ifugao always wanted to do is build 2 granaries, alungs, in their lifetime, because that was a demonstration of wealth. Well, guess what? That story about building barns, right, carries a lot of weight to them because there's cultural implications. And I can still get my theological points across by using a story that communicates strongly to them. And then there's, if you're doing a story set, then how do you jump from one story to the next story? And if they don't happen to be in line, or maybe 1,000 years pass, so there's some curricular implications there that you have to tie those things together as we jump from one story to the next. Sequence then gets into what is the order that we present this. And as Lowen found out, order is almost as important, and he said it was actually more important than the stories themselves, how they are sequenced together. One of the things you could do, if we did, for example, we did the Genesis through 1 through 11, which is all those foundational stories in the worldview of where you get in who is God, how was the world created, what was sin, and all this type of thing, and the different spirits and so forth, all those, and the flood. And so those are foundational worldview issues. And so when we look for those stories, we're looking for who are the key characters in it, what are the topics being covered, what are the terms that are constantly repeated. And that means we have to go back then, understand how they understand each one of those stories. How do they understand creations? How do they understand the flood? And interesting, the Ifugao are one of the few groups in the world that have no creation story. Their history begins with the flood. And so, as Gomangan said, here's how we should do evangelism. Start with the flood, and then ask them, well, how do we get there? And then go back to Genesis and work your way back through. And also gets into sin and evil, right? So what's their concept of sin and evil? And for Ifugao, sin is never like we think about sin. You broke a law before God. No. Sin is just a bad thing I did to somebody else, not a problem. So all those concepts, God, sin, creation, flood, we have to know their background in that. So Who are the key characters? What are the key topics? What are the key terms that we need to know? A third cross-cultural organizing principle that he mentions is it takes place some way. So now we're into methodology. How are you going to structure your curriculum? And we've talked about storyboarding before, using when God makes you laugh, and when these three guys show up in the desert, right, with Abraham and Sarah, and we storyboarded that around like that. And that's one of the ways we can do it as a method, and a very effective way of doing it as well. And we also could do it through characters, and we call this the character theology. So doing a little tease here for next week, and we'll get into character theology, where personalities proceed propositions, and we can use characters as a way of teaching and communicating. Another methodology that I like to use is what I call maximum impact stories, and that you use a number of different things as you teach the story so that you have maximum impact from that story itself. What questions do you incorporate? We have the story itself. Can you interject some art into that? What's the dialogue you want to take place? What are symbols and rituals that could help make this story become, pertinent to them in their life? Drama could be used, song could be used, and other ones that you could think of. So we want to have maximum impact lessons when we develop our curriculum here and put this together. Okay, well, the Bible stories itself, or the stories we're telling, right, are going to take place in some context. Where does it take place? Is it the demonic on the east side of the Sea of Galilee there, where Jesus is out with the pigs? And so what's going on there? So the context is going to be very, very important. We have to be able to line things up with that context of that Bible story. And then another organizing principle is going to be then the purpose, the goals that we set forth, the objectives that we set forth. And if we're doing a story set, what's the goals for the story set? And what's the individual goals for each of the stories or objectives, depending on, if you like, which terms you want to use. Or same thing for an individual lesson. And then are we going topical? Are we going chronological? So, when you lay different sized bricks, you always have to keep the whole wall in mind when we're doing that. So that has to be behind there. So what's the purpose that we have for the story set or this individual lesson and so forth? One of the things that we did, and I have the first phase for Ifugao here, that we did for evangelism, and on the red part of the slide, those are the objectives that we had, that we were trying to accomplish, and on the top yellow across, those are the stories we selected, and then we could just check off every objective that was met through those stories, and that helped us to see where we were going and if we were covering what we needed to cover, and if certain things received more emphasis than others, or certain things didn't get enough emphasis that they would have to have. So another thing we would ask then, when we get into the question side of it, what does the story set, or what does this individual story make us believe? And that's a pretty typical question that is asked many times in the curriculum. I like to challenge that a little bit and switch it and go from what to who. Character, right? Back to characters. Who does the story set or the story make us want to follow? So we got away from what to who, and we got away from believe to follow. That makes everything much, much more concrete for our follows. So we move from good, better to best in this thing. And that leads us to what we've called the need then for when we get to the application side of it, character-centric questions, not content-centric questions, but character-centric questions. Because if we go through the characters, we'll actually get the content, but we're starting from something that's very concrete and moving to something that's much more abstract. So, questions that we could ask after a story's been told. Who was your favorite character in this story? Your least favorite? And that'll get a lot of discussion going. You'll start to see a lot of culture come out at that point. Who made wise choices? Who was shamed? Who was polluted or made unclean? What other choices could so and so, take the character out of the story, could Sarah had made when those three guys came up? How did God react to Sarah's choices? Or who is and this is a big one, who ends up to be the hero of the story? And what does this story, or I should, excuse me, how does this story impact your family? Notice I didn't say you, I didn't start with you, because that's the individual size, right? If you're working with a collective side, don't start with you, start with the family. And that family is probably more than the nuclear family, it's probably the extended family, right? So how does this story impact your family? And then you can go to you. So we get it in there. And then the final cross-cultural organizing principle that we would have, and that gets into evaluation then. And there's two types of evaluation that we want to be doing. One that is the end of it, as we're at the end of it now, that's called summative. But we also want to do evaluation after every lesson is taught. That's formative, we call that. So those are the two types of evaluation we want going on. One goes on throughout every lesson, and at the end we go back and we say, what happened? What was good? What was bad? What do we need to change? How can we make this better? So that'll give you a little overview of curriculum development and working as a team, and some of the questions we need to ask and the focus we need to make those questions so that we can come up with solid curricula that will impact them for the Lord Jesus Christ. So you've got enough there to get you in deep trouble, but you got enough there to get you a solid foundation for something more that can be developed on this topic.